At a recent luncheon lectionary, Susan told a story that one year she visited a large church in Houston for Easter. She sat next to a friendly woman and her 6-year-old son. He was a remarkably good singer and sang each hymn with gusto, even if he didn't exactly know all the words. When they sang, "Up from the grave he arose," instead of with a mighty triumph for his foes, when Jesus came up from the grave, he arose with a lot of dirt between his toes. And you know what? Theologically, that is much more sound. Jesus' life had much less to do with any kind of triumph, except for love, and walking alongside suffering humanity in the dirt, muck, and mud of our lives. Indeed, Jesus would have had very dirty toes. And that's true both in his life as well as in his resurrection. And how do we know? Well, the scars on his back and the holes in his hands and feet, the nail wounds, they were not healed during his time in the tomb. When he emerged, he still had the marks of violence against him. He even offered to show them to his skeptical disciples. But even though Jesus was still marked by the violence against him, violence did not have the final say. This violence did not and does not have the final say. There is life after crucifixion.
And yet, given the amount of violence in our world today, that's almost as hard to believe as up from the grave he arose. As the Apostles' Creed says, Jesus was crucified, dead, and buried. And we get that. And since last Easter, 550,000 people have died of COVID-19. And except for a nurse and Jesus in every room, most of them died alone. Each person with a name. Starting with Stephen Schwartz in Seattle. We are surrounded by Good Fridays. In 2020 alone, the crucifixions of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Danielle Prude, and Breonna Taylor, and way too many more names than we've ever heard. Boulder, now added to the long list of cities known for their mass shootings, and among their names, Officer Eric Talley and Suzanne Fountain. Some Americans are only now coming to understand or even believe the centuries-long Good Fridays of violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and among their names in Atlanta, Soon Chung Park, Hyun Jung Grant, Young Ai-yu, and Suncha Kim. As the hashtag says, we say their name because we see the power in the example of Jesus himself. When Jesus said, "Mary," when he said her name outside the tomb, she recognized him. And then what did she say? Jesus told her, "Don't hold me back." And from there, she began to spread the good news that there is life after crucifixion. Yes, we know Good Friday all too well. Jesus was crucified, dead, and buried. That we certainly understand. But on the third day, he rose again. Of that we might not be quite so certain and struggle to wrap around our brains. However, curiously, more people come to Easter morning worship than any other Sunday of the year to hear a message about a concept many people find at best implausible or just impossible. What explains our desire to hear Christ is risen on Easter year after year? I don't think it's just tradition. There's something deeper inside that wants to hear those words and more. For example, Brian Stevenson has spent his life working with men, women, and children on death row. Some were unjustly accused, aided by manufactured false witness, but some did their truly heinous crimes. And of them, Brian says, we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. Now, if I'm being honest, that feels almost as implausible to say as Christ is risen. But there is more to life than crucifixion, and there is life after crucifixion. On my desk, I have a little yellow sticky note with a quote. I was on a webinar and I heard it and I quickly jotted it down. Your best hopes are just as likely to come true as your worst fears. Something in that statement, in the context of our global pandemics of racism and the coronavirus, struck a chord. And perhaps it too is implausible, but I really want to hear this. I really want to believe it. Our best hopes really are just as likely to come true as our worst fears. Or is that just wild-eyed optimism? I mean, is that just the white male privilege of someone for whom things have generally worked out? So I don't want to just offer a bunch of quotes to you today, but I do want to share one more by a Unitarian minister in the 1850s named Theodore Parker. Parker was an abolitionist dedicated to ending the enslavement of human beings and died just before the Civil War. He said, I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eyes reach but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight, but I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice. We know this quote more simply as the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe bends long, but it bends toward justice. You know, today is not only Easter, but the anniversary of his assassination, April 4th, 1968. Dr. King used this quote many times, and it too is something I both believe and something I want to believe, but at times I'm not so sure. The arc of the moral universe bends long, but it bends toward justice. Now, clearly, Dr. King knew it was not inevitable. It requires faith. He didn't say this quote as an optimist. He was in the midst of and scarred by a dirty, violent battle for the soul of America that still rages today. And in that battle, he was always grounded and guided by his faith in the crucified, risen Christ. You know, as well, when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, King said, I have an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of humankind. Such faith gives us courage. When our days become dreary with low hovering clouds and our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, we will know that we are living in the creative turmoil of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. Dr. King was scarred by violence, but not naive. Somehow, he always believed in an America that was better than the one in which he lived. Again, not because of inevitability, but because of faith, a real faith that knows real pain. Pain like the Good Friday crucifixions and the Holy Saturdays, full of waiting, along with everyone else in Minneapolis, sitting nervously at the edge of our seats, both believing and disbelieving that any kind of justice will come for George Floyd. We're still waiting for justice for Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain. We look around this country awash with weapons of war and fear, the next mass shooting or the next armed insurrection. We watch one legislature after another try to deprive people of color the right to vote. We fear that vaccine-hesitant people will cause this pandemic to drag out forever. But remember, on the third day, Jesus told Mary, "Don't hold me back. Go and tell everyone that there is life after crucifixion." And so that's why I can believe the arc of the moral universe bends long, but it bends toward justice. But not just believe. And believe that our best hopes are just as likely to come true as our worst fears. But not just believe. I believe we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. But not just believe. And I believe that Christ is risen. And yet, how can we reduce such a belief to mere explanation? We have to feel its truth. Like Theodore Parker said, to divine it by conscience. And then, unburdened by mere intellectual assent, we can put that truth into action alongside the Jesus who, when he came up from the grave, arose with a lot of dirt between his toes. In his life and in his resurrection, Jesus didn't invite us to merely believe, but he invited us to get dirty in the muck and mud of Good Friday crucifixions along suffering humanity, and wait with one another through Holy Saturdays of fear and anxiety. Only then, in life after crucifixion, is our belief transformed into rejoicing that Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed.